And thanks so much for joining us. This month's speaker for the Canadian Transfusion Trials Group Methodology Lecture Series is Dr. Jennie Haw, PhD, who is a sociologist and scientist in donation policy and studies at Canadian Blood Services and an adjunct research professor in the Department of Health Sciences at Carleton University. She's a qualitative methodologist with specialization in the sociology of health and donation studies, and draws on social theories to examine donation with the context of broader health and social systems. And a key area of her focus is a research program in understanding blood donation from the perspectives of historically excluded and underrepresented groups, and identifying social and structural barriers and enablers to donation. And she is going to be speaking to us on the topic of community-based research. And Jennie, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to present today and to share some of what I know about community-based research and my experience with community-based research. So these are the objectives for today. So to provide an overview of community-based research with kind of a focus on how it's been applied in health, but I will provide a little bit of a historical overview of its use in social science, as well as some of the theoretical underpinning of community-based research. And then I thought it would be good to walk through some examples of conducting community-based research, just drawing on some of my own experience with this approach to research. And then finally, I think it's important to just consider some of the tensions and challenges in conducting community-based research. So I'll end my talk today with some considerations there, and then I hope to have some time for questions and answers. So before I get started, I thought it would be good to share with you, just by situating myself in relation to this work and how it is that I come to this topic. So as Jason mentioned, I'm a sociologist and specialize in the sociology of health and illness, and more recently in the sociology of donation. So as a sociologist, what that means is that I think about how social structures, interactions, and systems shape and inform people's actions and behaviors. I'm also a qualitative methodologist, so a lot of the tools that I use are in-depth interviews, focus groups, observation, textual materials, and other kind of textual documents. And I've been at Canadian Blood Services as a social scientist since the fall of 2019. And one of the ways I describe myself as a researcher is to describe myself as a pragmatist. So what that means is that a lot of my research projects are initiated through some of the questions and challenges that are facing CBS and other communities that I might be working with. And really, I aim for my research to do something. So to have an impact in some way, a positive impact, and to have research action, to have research actioned. And so since I've been at CBS, so since the fall of 2019, just bringing together my own interests alongside CBS's, the challenges that the blood operator is facing. A lot of my work has focused on understanding and improving engagement with underrepresented communities and groups. And when I started looking into this work, I quickly realized that the only way that I could really do this research was to take a community-based approach. So that's what got me started in learning about community-based research and how to apply it in my own work. And I would say, I continue to learn about community-based research. I've been applying this approach for several years now, but I certainly have a lot to learn, and I consider myself to continue to learn about this approach and all of its complexities and how to do it well. So I thought I would just ask all of you, just get a sense from all of you how you what your experience with community-based research is. So if you have your phones close by, if you could scan the QR code and then just answer the question. And I'm not an experienced Mentimeter person, so if it's not working, just let me know. I'm guessing that it's not working for folks. Is that right? Can I just get a thumbs up or?
I voted, but it
Okay.
doesn't look like anything's coming up.
Oh, it's not showing. Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's accepted my vote.
Okay.
But yeah, if it didn't go through to you.
Okay. There might be some way to make it show up. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure how to make it show up on the screen, but if people feel comfortable sharing what their experience with CBPR, maybe just very quickly, or putting it into the chat, maybe we can do it that way. Maybe as people are doing that, I will continue and advance to the next slide. Okay. So I'll turn now to a bit of an overview of community-based research. And again, as I said, I'll focus on how it's been applied in health research, but I will start with a little bit more of a broad overview of this research methodology. So community-based research, it's known by many different names: community-based participatory research, action research, collaborative inquiry, I think in clinical settings, patient-oriented or patient-centered research. I've also recently been hearing co-design or co-design method. And I think what all of these approaches share is that they're grounded in some shared principles around community engagement, participant engagement, mutual learning, and they value conducting research with communities and not on communities. So really a contrast to more of what we've considered in the past extractive methods of research, where researcher will go into a community or into a group, take what they need in terms of data, and then go away and do their research without the communities or participants necessarily knowing what the results were, and may not necessarily benefit from the research that was conducted. In terms of the roots of community-based research, I want to just show three different figures who I think are instrumental in shaping some community-based research in the social sciences. So to the bottom, to the left, Kurt Lewin in the 1940s was a social scientist. He is attributed with first coining this term action research. And he was really convinced that to change people's behavior, the people who'll be affected should also be involved in the research. And he worked in the US. And his approach really emphasized the power relationship between the researcher and those researched. And he really sought to involve the latter, encouraging their participation in studying the effects of their own actions. Further along, Paulo Freire, pictured in the middle here, he is a researcher out of Brazil. He published a very well-known book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed in the 1970s. He worked in the domain of education, and he also really believed that research could have an emancipatory effect. He was really committed to using research and doing research in a way that challenged existing power structures and in a way that really elevated the learners and really focused on the learners in research. And then to the right is Linda Tweeway Smith. She's an Indigenous scholar out of New Zealand. She published a really well-known book called Decolonizing Methodologies in the late 1990s. And she really traces the history of scientific knowledge as it developed and traces how it didn't serve or benefit Indigenous peoples as it theoretically was intended to do. And so she argues for a different approach to research that doesn't reproduce colonialist ideas and methods, but instead shares power between the researcher and the people being researched. So community-based research has been recognized as a really important approach, especially when working with underrepresented and marginalized groups, many of whom have not been well served and may have even been harmed by research. And those of you on this call are likely familiar with some high-profile examples or cases in the States. So the Tuskegee syphilis trial is often mentioned. There's the case of Henrietta Lacks and the establishment of the HeLa cell line from the US. But I also wanted to draw attention to an example in Canada. Some of you may be familiar with this, but this is an example of the New Chalnoth in BC on Vancouver Island. This is an article that was published in Nature in 2002, and it's regarding a case that was 20 years ago where members of this community gave blood samples for research to understand the genetic causes of rheumatoid arthritis. So this was a condition that was highly prevalent in their community. So they agreed to give blood samples to a researcher who said that he was going to study the genetic causes of this condition with the idea that they would benefit, that members in their community would benefit from participating in this research. What happened was this researcher wasn't able to show any genetic basis for rheumatoid arthritis. It's very possible that there wasn't the genetic testing technologies at the time, and genetic science hadn't evolved to a place where that was possible at the time. But he took the blood samples, took them to 2 other universities. He left Canada, went to the States, and then went on to the UK and continued to do research on these blood samples without informing the communities, without getting consent, and also without any benefits to communities who had given him this their biological samples or their blood samples. And so this continues to cast a long shadow in terms of involvement of Indigenous peoples with research and trust in researchers by Indigenous peoples in Canada. I want to turn now to community-based research in health. And some of this work has been done by Barbara Israel, who's pictured here. I have one of her articles here. This was published in 1998. So it's a little bit older now, and they've published, I believe, an edited book since then. But she and her colleagues have done some really good work on community-based research in health. And in this review, they kind of provide a bit of an overview and historical look. And in the 1980s and 90s, public health researchers began to question the focus on individual level factors at the neglect of social and environmental factors affecting people's health. And so this is probably around the time when the social determinants of health, that kind of literature started to emerge as well. There was a growing recognition of the growing gap in health status between social groups. So this includes, people with more or less resources, so rich versus poor, white versus racialized groups. And there was growing recognition in the gap between knowledge created or research done and a lack of application of research results and improvements in the health status of people that they were intended to benefit. So researchers and practitioners started to call for more attention to the complex issues that compromise health of people in marginalized communities. They called for more integration of research and practice and for greater community involvement and control. And so Israel and colleagues describe how this critical reflection, coupled with new funding opportunities that favored a more community-centered approach at around this time, led to new partnership approaches to research that were referred to as, people refer to it as community-based, community-involved, community collaborative. So again, you can see some different ways to name this kind of research that was done. And so they talk about this kind of shift in thinking and recognition of the importance to do research differently than how it had been done before, and the emergence of community-based partnerships and community-based research. And alongside that, they also talk about a shift in research paradigm, or shift in thinking around how research is done, that also coincided with community-based research. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that here. So by scientific paradigm, you might have heard of it in different ways. Some people refer to it as a grand theory, philosophical ideas. These are ideas or beliefs that underlie all research. So all researchers come to our research, whether we're explicit about it or not, with a certain set of beliefs about the nature of reality, what we can know about it, the relationship between the knower or the researcher and what is known or knowable. And lastly, how we as the knower or the researcher can find out about what it is that we're trying to know or trying to study. And so leading up to the emergence of community-based research, the kind of paradigm that dominated in health research or public health research is what's often called the positivist paradigm. And a positivist paradigm views reality as existing as a single reality. It can be known from what can be observed and what can be measured. This reality, so these this thing that we're trying to study is independent of the knower or the researcher. And so because of this independence, really the aim of the knower is to remain as distant and value-free from what is being studied as possible. So in other words, trying not to bias what it is that we're trying to know or study. And so this approach, this positivist paradigm that is often applied in physical, biological sciences, was also applied in research that looked at the social domain. With the emergence of community-based research, the theoretical underpinning of community-based research is more aligned with what's called critical and constructivist paradigms. And these are different paradigms. However, I've combined them because they're similar enough for our purpose here, and just to simplify things a bit. But these paradigms view reality as influenced by social, political, economic, cultural, gender, etc. factors. So in other words, reality is influenced by one's social location in the social domain. Reality isn't single, but it's multiple. So in other words, reality is constructed through the ideas, perceptions, meanings that we hold about something. And these are shaped or informed by our social location. And so reality is not independent. If we understand reality as constructed and constructed through meanings and ideas, it is also not independent of the knower or the researcher. And instead, results are shaped by the relationship between the knower or the researcher and the participant. And lastly, findings are mediated by values. So researchers, all knowers, can't separate our values from what we study and the results that we generate. So Israel and colleagues outline that really nicely in their article, and they show how community-based research is more consistent and aligned with critical and constructivist paradigms. What I want to point out here is that this does not mean that community-based research is only consistent with a particular kind of research method. So for example, it's not only qualitative methods that can be used when you're conducting community-based research. I happen to be a qualitative methodologist, those are the methods that I use, but community-based research, you can apply the approach to studies that take a quantitative approach. And there are also studies, clinical trials have applied a community-based approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides later. But I wanted to just flag that for folks, that community-based research is an approach, and you can apply a range of methods to a community-based study. So Israel and colleagues also outline various principles that should guide community-based research. And here they point to the fact that these principles are dynamic, they're not static. They likely will and should change over time as more people conduct community-based research with different groups and populations and different contexts. But here's what I think is a good list of principles that should guide community-based research. So they begin by saying recognizing the community as a unit of identity, building on the strengths and resources within the community, facilitating collaborative partnerships in all phases of the research project, balancing research and action for the mutual benefit of everyone involved, promoting co-learning and empowering processes that attends to social inequities. Here, I think of this also as power sharing and sharing decision-making in all aspects of the research process. It should be cyclical and iterative, disseminating findings and knowledge gained to all parties. So here, as researchers, we're often very well aware of sharing our research results with other researchers, academics, but this is really about foregrounding knowledge dissemination to the communities who have been involved and communities affected. And lastly, long-term commitment from all partners. So I think, if you think about these principles and what they say, they seem that they're very aspirational, I would say, and it's not always possible to apply all of the principles in their kind of ideal way, ideal form in all research studies. And I think it's important to note that Israel and colleagues also note this and understand this, and more researchers who apply community-based methodology recognize that these principles are really important to guide research, but it's not always possible to apply all of them in the ideal way in all studies, nor is it always appropriate, I would argue. So this is another way to think about applying principles to research, as well as just the range in which community engagement or community involvement can take shape in community engaged research. This is a figure that I've taken from an article published by Key and colleagues. It was published in 2019. And they summarize community-based research that's been conducted in health. They too, note that over the past couple of decades, there's been a real increase in community-engaged research in health. But they are responding to what some in the field of community-based research have started to kind of assess different kinds of projects that claim to take a community-based approach, or whether or not they've done it right, in quotes, or wrong. And they argue that, Key and colleagues argue that really we should be thinking about community-based research as existing along a continuum, where on one end of the spectrum, you have community-based participatory research or community-driven research. So this would be examples of studies where the community is involved in all phases of the project, in some cases where they initiate the study themselves, all the way over to the other end of the continuum, where the community is really more informed more than anything else. And so they haven't been involved in every step of the research project, but researchers are attending to and ensuring that communities are informed of the research that they're doing and the results that they're finding and learning. And this is to acknowledge that not all communities, not all research projects, not all contexts are going to be amenable to conducting a community-based project in its most kind of ideal way. And this ought not to deter people from trying to take a community-based approach. I find this actually really productive. I find this a productive way to think about community-engaged research. I continue to refer to my work as community-based or CBPR, but I think of it as a continuum. And I think that this is a way to encourage researchers to take up this approach, to think about the principles that underlie community-based research, and to apply it in a way that makes most sense and is feasible and is led by the communities that they're working with. Here's another way to just think about the continuum of community participation. On the top, you see there's more intensive community involvement or participation, where community members are involved in all aspects of the research, from defining the research questions all the way through to disseminating the findings, and then down to less intensive, where community members might just be involved in some certain discrete steps of the study, but it's otherwise more of a researcher designed and a researcher-led study. I want to turn now to a couple systematic reviews that have been completed on the application of community-based research in clinical trials to enhance participation from underrepresented racialized groups. So there was a recognition that that racialized people are less involved in clinical trials, and so the systematic review wanted to look at the papers that had applied a community-based research approach to clinical trials research. So this was a study. This first review was conducted by Delesnusis in 2012. They looked at published papers from 2003 to 2010. They found 19 published studies that applied a CBPR approach. Interestingly, 14 of the 19 had been published from 2007 to 2010. So you can see that it's relatively recent. And they found that the level of detail provided in the articles regarding the community participation was highly variable. So this means how the authors described what community partners did, how researchers engaged with community partners, that really ranged. So the level of description included and provided in the articles really ranged. CBPR trials had a high success rate in recruiting and retaining underrepresented racialized participants. And the authors suggest that CBPR may be effective in increasing participation of underrepresented racialized people in research. So if we move forward to 2022, McFarlane and colleagues did a follow-up to the systematic review published in 2012. They looked at papers from 2010 to quite an increase in the numbers of clinical trials that take a CBPR approach. So 19 versus 104. And McFarlane and colleagues, they find that CBPR seems to be advantageous when recruiting underrepresented racialized groups from clinical trials. And again, they also find that it's difficult to assess engagement of underrepresented groups, and it's hard to know how researchers engaged or communicated with the different groups and communities. They find that applying a CBPR approach can increase rigor in scientific studies, and they conclude that more details on community engagement and the community engagement process is needed. My thought on the variability in terms of how communities are involved and engaged in the research process, part of that, in my experience, has to do with the journals in which we publish. And a lot of clinical journals, in my experience, publishing in transfusion medicine journals, we're bound by word limit. And a lot of times, clinical journals, the word limit is actually much smaller than you might find in a social science journal. And so that makes it challenging for to include all the details around community engagement, which you might otherwise want to include in your publication. And so I just wanted to flag that, to say, I think as community-based research is taken up more widely, and as people publish and write about their work in community-based methods, I think it's important to think about how to make it possible for us to be able to write up our results in more comprehensive and transparent ways. Okay, so I want to turn now to planning and conducting a community-based study. So in other words, how do we take, the principles underlying or guiding community-based research into more kind of concrete steps? What should we be thinking about? What are some things to consider in conducting a community-based study? So in other words, what does this mean in practice? And so here are just various components that I think we need to be thinking about, or that I think about as I start to think about putting together a community-based project. You see a lot of the studies, some of the systematic reviews that assessed, how well different people may have applied a community-based project. Look at kind of the blue icons here. So the kind of steps that we often think about in a research study: identifying a research question, developing the study design, participant recruitment, data collection, data analysis, knowledge dissemination, and the community's involvement in those steps. I have also included, it's important to also think about forming the research team, who is part of the research team, what role will they play, as well as forming a community advisory group. Will you form a community advisory group? Is it appropriate for the study that is being considered? And if so, what role will the community advisory group play? So just a few of the questions to consider when thinking about planning the research study, as well as some of the earlier stages of the study. So thinking about forming the research team and a community advisory group: who is initiating the study and why? Is the study being initiated by a community member or a partner? Is it being initiated by a researcher? Who will lead the project? Will it be a project that will be primarily led by the researcher? Is there a way for the project to be led by a community member? There are some examples where projects are a community-led approach. Or will it be kind of a co-led model where a community member and a researcher co-lead the project together? Who will form the community advisory group? I should say, will you form a community advisory group? That question is probably needed there. And if so, who will you include in the community advisory group, and what will they be asked to do? So a lot of the CBPR projects have the way in which they involve communities, the way in which they integrate communities and community members into the research process, is to form a community advisory group. Some people call it a community advisory board, an advisory board, or an advisory committee. I think in the cases of clinical research involving patients, there may be patient advisory boards. And so this is something to consider when thinking about a community-based approach. If you want to form one, who do you want on that board and why? And this will be informed by what it is that board will be asked to do. How were the aims of the study and research questions identified? So who was the one, or which groups were instrumental in coming up with the aims of the study, in deciding the research questions? And, again, this is about decision-making. Who has some decision-making power over the research project? because the aims of the study and the research questions that are guiding the project will play a very big role in determining the direction of the study itself. So this is just an example of a study. I'll walk through some of how this project, how we thought through some of the research team, community advisory group participation for this study. This is a study that I have worked very closely with Sickle Cell Disease Association of Canada, so SCDAC, and Biba Tinga, who's the president of this organization. This study goes back to 2020 when we first initiated our collaborative working relationship. And this is a study that was actually initiated by SCDAC. So they approached CBS to ask if CBS could work with them or partner with them on some social science research. And I had just joined CBS as a social scientist just several months before. And so they initiated this study and they came with a clear idea of what they wanted to understand. So they wanted to understand barriers and enablers to blood donation for people of African ancestry, because their real aim and goal is to increase blood donation from people of African ancestry to better meet the needs of people with living with sickle cell disease. They were also very clear that they wanted to focus on a young adult population. So they said, we really want to hear from the youth in our communities, and we want to focus on this population. And so we built that right into the objectives. So had a clear idea of what they wanted to be as the aim of this project. They were also brought on to the research project as members of the research team. And so they were involved in every stage of the research project. As I said, coming up with the objectives and the research questions. They were involved in writing the grant application. We applied for a SURE grant. We were successful in that. They were involved in that. They reviewed all the RUB documents that we put together. And they were very, very committed to doing this work alongside with me. And Biba has been a co-lead on all of our research projects together. And this was the first project that we started on, and we've continued to work on several projects since, and our research collaboration continues. But one of the things that we decided as a research team was that we decided we wanted to form a community advisory group. We knew, we anticipated that we would have some challenges recruiting young adults to our research study. And so we wanted some help from a community advisory group in recruiting for our study. And we also wanted their input on the study instruments, so the interview guide. We wanted their input on the recruitment poster, as well as input on data analysis and recommendations from our results. So we wanted members on our community advisory group who had some experience with sickle cell disease. They didn't have to be living with sickle cell, but to have some experience and interest and awareness of sickle cell, as well as some awareness and interest in blood donation. And ideally, if they were younger and within the age range of the folks we were trying to recruit for the study, then that was ideal. So for us, the way we approached this is we actually created an ad for people to contact us if they were interested in being a member of the community advisory group. And we assessed people who are interested to see how well they fit with what it is that we were hoping the community advisory group would do with us on this project. And we formed our community advisory group that way. I won't go into details about how we organized and kind of structured the way we communicated and their involvement in the project, but we did, formalize the community advisory group by developing a terms of reference. We provided them with an honorarium. We let them know in advance, at the outset of the project, when we anticipated needing to hear from them so that they would have that information as far in advance as possible. And so we tried to give them as much information as we could at the outset, with the understanding that, as is the case with most research studies, what you anticipate you'll do often changes as the study progresses. So we let them know about that as well. They were also really instrumental in giving us guidance on the recruitment poster for the study participants, and we have that here, the need for blood. This final poster looks very different from what we had initially. We also had a lot of discussion around whether or not to include a specific picture of somebody in the recruitment ad and what that might mean for representation and diversity amongst people in the African, Caribbean, and Black communities. And so their input was really key and instrumental in that. They also provided a lot of feedback for our interview guide, and they let us know what they thought we should be focusing on in the interviews as well. So turning now to data collection and analysis. So things to consider, again, who will participate in data collection? How will community partners be involved in data collection, if at all? If you have a community advisory group, will folks from the community advisory group be involved in data collection? If so, why? If not, why not? How will your community advisory group and/or community partners be involved in data analysis? So this is another really important question. What role will they play? What will you ask them to participate in? What skills and knowledge will they bring to their role as community advisory group members? And how can you incorporate their experience, their knowledge, and their expertise into your data analysis? So thinking about data collection and data analysis, I just want to turn to another study that I conducted with applying a community-based approach. And this project is, for this one, we worked with trans and gender diverse community members, as well for a study that aimed to understand experiences of trans and gender diverse donors. So we wanted to understand the experience of people who were current donors who were gender diverse. On this research team, we had members who were gender diverse. We also formed a community advisory group, although for this study, we actually identified people in advance who we wanted on the community advisory group, and we reached out to them individually to see if they'd be interested in this study. And so we selected and formed the community advisory group for this one in a slightly different way. I can provide more details or discussion about that after if you're interested. And these were the objectives that we developed together. But on the topic of data collection and data analysis, so for this project, we recognized from the outset that it was important for the study participants to feel safe and comfortable with the interviewer. And so we wanted to ideally offer participants the option to be interviewed by somebody who is gender diverse, if that were their preference. So we had gender diverse folks on our research team, but we also wanted to offer our community advisory group members an opportunity to conduct interviews and to be a part of that data generation process if they were interested and if this was something that they had the time and capacity for. So we had one member from our community advisory group who was interested and wanted to be involved in data collection with us. So in total, there were 3 of us who conducted interviews. I'm the only one of the 3 of us who is cisgender. The other 2 are gender diverse. And so what we did to have everyone prepared and ready to be involved in data collection was to take the time needed to train the community advisory group member, as well as the other research team member, on how to conduct semi-structured interviews. And so that involved, so I worked with them very closely. That was involved, several meetings over several hours, sharing readings with them, walking through the semi-structured interview guide, going through a practice, and then having an opportunity to go through a mock interview so that everyone felt comfortable doing the interviews and data collection once we got started with that. So I just want to highlight that because it's a big commitment from members on community members to take this up. It involves time to learn, to practice, and then our community advisory group member went on to conduct many of the interviews. So we conducted 85 interviews in total, and he conducted well over 30 of those interviews. And so this is just, he was able to do it, but it's not always possible for all community members to be able to put the time in to be able to do this. I do think our study benefited from his involvement, but I just wanted to flag that sometimes it's not always feasible. You can see from this figure that we were also attentive to the power relations between researchers and the study participants. And so we provided all our study participants the option to be, so in addition to giving them the option to be interviewed by somebody who's trans, non-binary, or cisgender, they all had the option to review their interview transcript. So we wanted to ensure that participants felt comfortable sharing with us, and also safe that they could review their transcript. If there was anything in the transcript that they felt they needed to clarify that wasn't captured quite correctly in the interview itself, they would have some time to go back, reflect on that, and to revise their transcript if they wanted to do that. They could also add additional details if they felt that at the time of the interview and in the interview transcript, something wasn't as clear as they wanted it to be. And really this was so that they could feel that they had some power and control over the data collection process as well. In terms of data analysis, we decided that the research team would do the data analysis. And then what we did was we presented the results to the community advisory group and provided time for discussion. And we wanted their input on what we had learned and heard, and their input on recommendations from the results. So one of the key primary aims of this study was to really provide the blood operator with some recommendations and key action items that could be enacted to improve the experiences of gender diverse and trans donors. And so our community advisory group was really instrumental in identifying priorities, in saying this is what we think is really important, and identifying the key action items that we then put into an internal report. So knowledge dissemination. What is the role of the community advisory group in knowledge dissemination? How will communities learn of the results? And what is prioritized in knowledge dissemination? And lastly, who gets authorship? So I'm gonna maybe move through these, and I just realized the time. So in both of our studies, we came up with various outputs, some primarily for communities. So this recruitment guide is one that was designed for communities, and it was really led by SCDAC. We held knowledge exchange events, and we also published in Transfusion. We published some of our results in Transfusion, and we invited community advisory groups to be co-authors on our publication. That's the same with the second study. We also produced a return of results to study participants. That's this pamphlet here on the left, and co-published again with our community advisory committee members. And for this second study here, another really important output from this study was an internal report, as I said, to CBS to really action some of the recommendations that we came up with from our study. Okay, so I just want to end with some challenges and tensions. So I think, you know, up to now, the benefits and usefulness of community-based research, you know, I think are that it can lead to more relevant, useful data. It can improve the quality, validity of research. Can create theory grounded in social experience. It can involve communities. It can help build trust with communities. But community-based research is also not without challenges and tensions. And I think it's important to be aware of this from the outset. And lots of papers are published that detail some of the challenges and tensions that researchers have faced when conducting community-based research. Sharing power and control is a challenge, and there can be some tensions there. In an ideal world, and just from my own personal, you know, ethical commitments, in an ideal world, power and control would be equally shared between me as a researcher and community members. And I would say that the research that I do with BIBA and SCDAC is kind of a program of research where we really try to do this. However, it can be challenging because there are ways in which research and institutional, like the structures of research, the way research is organized, often provides more power or places more power in the hands of the researchers. So for example, oftentimes grants are held by the researcher. So we are responsible for the money. With REB applications, we're often the PI. And sometimes there's a lot of work involved in research. And as I said, community members often have full-time jobs and they do this work on their own time. And it's a lot of responsibility, and it's not always feasible for research team members to be involved and to share power throughout the entire research process. I think it's important to know this kind of going into a project and to think about how can we find ways to share power and decision-making, if not in an equal way, but in an equitable way. And how can we formalize that in the study design and how we agree to work together as a team. Resources can be limited, time, money, etc. Community research can take a long time, and I have found that community-based research, especially if you try to do it well, can take even more time. And sometimes there are timelines that are quite tight that we are very mindful of, and there can be some tensions there. Also, time, resources for community members. As I said, a lot of them are working full-time. This is work that they do on their own time. And so we need to be really mindful of that. So this is another example or reason why kind of the ideal type of community-based research where community members are involved in every phase of the research sometimes is just not feasible, and it's not something that community members can all take on. The same goes for longer term commitment. You know, many people are very busy, live very full lives. And so a long-term commitment can be challenging. I would also say that may not always be appropriate to have a longer term commitment. Sometimes there's a very discrete project, there's a very specific challenge that needs to be figured out. And so I think it can be appropriate at times to have just kind of a discrete project. Balancing knowledge and action. There have been times when if I have just my researcher hat on, the next stage of a project, I would think in my head should look like this. And my community partners have said, well, we think that we need to prioritize something that's more action-oriented, something that is maybe more focused on community engagement. So there can be that tension. My personal position and commitment to this work is to prioritize the action orientation of the communities I'm working with. And so I've adapted, what I might have done if it was just a purely research kind of driven project, to one that is more balanced with action and in foregrounds action, actually. And then lastly, who represents the community and how is community defined? And this might be odd to have this kind of as the last question, because I've been using community so often throughout this entire talk. I think it's important to recognize that what we mean by community, who is in the community, is not always clear. And sometimes boundaries around a community are very blurry. Communities can overlap. People can be involved in multiple communities. You might start a project thinking that you have an understanding of a community and learn very quickly that your view of the community, your understanding of the community is not what it actually is on the ground. And so I think I wanted to put this out there because I think it's important for us to be aware of this and also to continually be learning from the community members who we're working with, because they will have a better understanding of communities than we will. And our understanding of the communities we're working with may have to shift and change as we do this work. And also who from the community is representing the community on any research project. That's also an important consideration. Who from the community might be missed in being represented in the community on the project itself. So with that, thank you for your time. I think I might, very close to the end of time. Thank you for your time and attention.
Jenny, that was very interesting and very helpful, I think, for many of us in the medical community who have an interest in community-based research. If I could just start with a first question here. Do you think that is community-based research intrinsically tied to qualitative research, or is it possible to conduct sort of a traditional, hypothesis-driven, biomedical research project with a CBR approach?
Yeah, that's such a good question. No, it's not tied to a qualitative exploratory type study. And in fact, there are good examples of where people do more hypothesis-driven clinical trials research, quantitative surveys, and apply a community-based approach in a range of different research methods and methodologies. I appreciate the question, Jason, because I do really want to make it clear that it's not only for qualitative methodologists. I think that it really is up to the researcher who is interested and curious about taking a community-based approach to think about how can I apply these principles in a way that is appropriate and that will work with my skill set as a researcher, the kind of research study or research project that I'm aiming to do, as well as the communities that I'm hoping to engage in this project. So I think that, I would say that the challenge is on the researchers who are doing this work. I think you can come up with hypothesis-driven research where communities are involved, and you can think about how they might be involved. In some cases, it might involve the researcher coming up with some questions. It might involve a lot of pre-work. So, coming up, approaching communities to say, here's what we know from the research so far. Here's a hypothesis that we have. Here's what we're interested in understanding. What do you think? And getting communities' input that way, even before you start to kind of piece together the study that you might end up doing. But I think that there are ways to do it, and there are people out there doing it. And I would encourage folks who are interested in applying a community-based approach to, the full range of methods and methodologies that you all are trained in.
Oksana.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I'm just wondering if there is a repository or a list or some sort of national resource of community-based research consultants, or if this is work that sort of has become a niche for you, and there are very few community-based research consultants for researchers to connect with. I think this is very much a realm that I'm sure I wouldn't be alone in saying we don't know what we don't know, right? And so how do we as researchers find out more, and who do we connect with to make sure that when we're designing studies that we're mindful of community-based research and that we don't miss critical steps in engaging with community partners?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thanks for that. I don't know of any central repository. There is, however, actually, just having said that, there is a community-based research group. I can look that up, and maybe Jason, I can send you the link, and you can, or whomever, to distribute the link to this group. And they have a set of resources. They have regular webinars that you can attend. So I don't think this is unique to community-based research. I think often what happens is different disciplinary streams kind of approach a similar kind of work through different ways. And sometimes the streams can be a bit siloed, so they speak to each other. And so I think that there may be resources outside of CBPR in health. So like, for example, CBPR in education. So it's widely been used in education, research and education. There may be some really good resources there that health researchers may not be accessing or aware of. And also I would say vice versa. So I don't know of any central repository except that one group that comes to mind for me right now. And Oksana, I'm happy to share that with this group. If I can think of any others, I will also add that to the list. But I think it's a great, there are good resources out there. Barbara Israel's work is a great resource. So there's that article that they published in 1998. And then they've got an edited book that they published. I believe they published that in 2005. So it's a much more comprehensive collection that looks at community-based research. I would look to them as a great resource as well. But yeah, so maybe I'll stop there for that question, but I will to see if I can think of other kind of repositories or resources.
Okay.
No, that's perfect. And I should be transparent in saying that Mickey Zeller and I are the co-leads of the Community Engagement Working Group of CTTG. And so we are working in terms of helping to develop such a list or resources that ultimately will be posted on the CTTG website. So perhaps Mickey and I will be reaching out to you to have some further discussions so that we can make sure we have some guidance for our colleagues in transfusion medicine.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'm also thinking maybe even just a collection of key readings, right? Like, so even if it's not a central repository where, people can interact with other folks, maybe just a collection of, here are some like really well-written, comprehensive key readings of CBPR that's been applied in health. We might even look at slightly outside of health if it's useful. But yeah, I'm happy to connect with you and Mickey.
Great. Okay, we're a little past time now, so we should probably adjourn. Apologies to those who had questions that didn't get a chance to submit, but if you want to send an email, I'm sure Dr. Haw would be happy to respond. And Jenny, if you have readings or resources that you want me to share with the group, you can just send those to me by email and I'll distribute. And there's usually an evaluation form that we distribute to all attendees afterwards, and I'd ask everyone to fill that out and submit. Okay, thanks so much. Great talk. And we will see you all next month.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.